Alright, time to make another video. Today's video will be an argument for deflation. Now, in case you don't know what deflation is, deflation is the opposite of inflation. So, let's say the dollar loses 1% of its value annually. That is inflation. So, for example, $1 this year is equivalent to $1.01 next year. Deflation is the reverse of this. So while that's inflating, the dollar loses value, and thus to maintain the same value you need more. Deflation is the opposite. $1 today would be worth 99 cents the next year, assuming we're still going by a 1% rate for each. Now, one may ask, understandably, why would we prefer deflation? Because it looks like things are going down. Keep in mind, while it's going down here, the actual value of the dollar compared to other things is going up. So, for example, let's say there's a $5 bag of chips. Again, using the inflation of 1%, just to make it easier, those same chips will cost $5.05 the next year. Under a deflationary model, what will instead happen is that they'll be worth $4.95. And of course, things go more extreme the higher the percentage in whatever direction you're going. Now, for businesses, inflation is better because it means more money moving around. More money moving around means businesses make more. For example, let's take this dollar here. If you have to pay an extra cent with every dollar you spend, that means the business makes more money. It also importantly helps with stagnant costs like labor, because while the business rakes in more money, labor costs stay around the same most of the time. Now, over time, wages do as a whole tend to go up, just not at the same rate as inflation. This, of course, depends on everything from labor laws to minimum wage to economic growth. Generally speaking, though, wages are usually a bit behind inflation, especially nowadays. Now, one may ask further, why don't we have deflation? Well, simple. More money is inflation. You add more money to the economy, you get inflation. In order to cause deflation, you must either A, take money out of the economy, B, let money rot, so for example, every $200 bill isn't replaced, or C, increase production while keeping the dollar value the same, the amount of money the same. So if there's $50 in the economy, just hypothetically, and you produce 20 different goods, then what you're going to end up seeing is that those 20 goods are worth $50. But if the $50 stays the same, and suddenly there's 25 goods, well, then the money has to be spread across more and more. This means, naturally, that the individual dollar amount for each good goes down. This is the basics of supply and demand. But our government does the opposite, and they don't keep things the same or let things go down. They instead add more money over time through spending, bills, and just cheap loans. Because what is a cheap loan in essence? More money into the economy. Especially because banks, importantly, don't have all their money stocked up. They operate on a fractional reserve, so they may have 20% of all the money they've loaned out. So your savings is in theory assuming a bank run occurs. This means, naturally, that the amount of money in circulation goes up, and thus inflation. Though why do people seem so skeptical when such an idea is brought up? Why wouldn't they want the penny to actually be valuable rather than becoming so worthless that it is actually more profitable to simply not print pennies, literally printing money, than to have a penny that's actually worth its weight? Well, the simple answer is deflation has been somewhat demonized. See, throughout history, there have been periods of deflation, especially for the United States. The biggest one was, of course, the Gilded Age, and it's coinciding, there we go, with the Second Industrial Revolution, because so many goods were produced, and the U.S. government was relatively balanced as a budget. Not completely, but relatively. What ended up happening was money was relatively stagnant, and simultaneously, the goods produced went up. Deflation occurred, and this was a period known as the Great Deflation. But it was heavily associated with the Gilded Age. As a result, people weren't big fans of it. Because even though life for the average person was going up during the Gilded Age, it's hard to think about that, but to put it in perspective, let's say this is the price of goods. The grocery bag that you walk out of the store with every day. Okay? If wages are like this, completely stagnant, even going down a bit, I want you to fathom what this means. Even if wages are stagnant, the price of goods goes down, and so real wages grow. The difference between these two is shrinking over time, until eventually it is surpassed. That is what was happening during the Gilded Age, but what a lot of people saw was a bunch of businesses cutting people, and because people were easily replaced, wages remained relatively stagnant, going down a bit on occasion, especially during economic crises. And people, as one might imagine, were not a fan of their wages getting cut due to something completely outside of their control. So, the Gilded Age was demonized, and deflation really got hated during the Depression. See, the Depression was caused by many things, one of which was actually those cheap loans I mentioned earlier. After the establishment of the Federal Reserve, loans were allowed to be held at lower rates. But that creates a problem. As inflation rises, eventually the government needs to balance things out, or else people who have savings will end up, basically having their savings become worthless. And thus, inflation naturally has to be counteracted by increasing loans. Or sorry, not loans, but the rates of them. So if you're paying 2% on a variable interest loan, you could then be paying 5% because the Federal Reserve makes the money supply scarcer. Banks need to make up more money to balance things out, so they increase rates, and thus, naturally, interest rates rise. But this creates bubbles, because what ends up happening is, during periods of low interest, inflation rises, and vice versa. But remember, when you're taking out a loan at a cheaper rate, you're relying heavily on that lower interest rate. If the reason you're taking a loan at 2% and not 5% is because you couldn't afford the 5% loan, but it's currently 2%, so you're taking the risk, the moment that price goes up and you have to pay more because of rising interest rates, you're going to financially collapse. Because again, the linchpin of your planning was the interest rates. This is especially true in modern times with quantitative easing in full swing, but it was effective even back in the 1920s for causing issues. Another big issue, funnily enough, was actually trying to keep wages high. During the Depression, Herbert Hoover tried to keep wages up to prevent people from just dropping spending because they had less money. Well, as it turns out, businesses didn't have the money to pay, and so they went bust, 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 and bust. And now the people who would have been paid, say, 5 cents or 10 cents were now getting paid nothing, which is so much better, clearly. And, of course, deflation was involved in the Depression. See, due to the World Wars, more specifically the first one, the United States produced a lot of goods. In the First World War, this was mainly stuff like grain, cotton, and other things that were needed to support Europe during the time period. Well, guess what happened once the war ended? Those farmers were still relying on that trade with Europe and their increased grain demand. And as one might imagine, that led to increased production of grain. Grain goes up, price goes down. Well, something had to bend, and eventually the farmers found themselves heavily indebted because they invested to make all that grain, while simultaneously the price of grain was going down. That was deflation for the grain market and for foodstuffs as a whole. Needless to say, they were not happy with this situation. Normally the market self-corrects. If deflation becomes a problem, inflation comes when businesses start going under and then goods stop being produced as high in terms of quantities. Same thing with inflation. We see it all the time. Take 2008 as an example. Prices get artificially inflated, then once they can't bear it anymore, the price crashes down, and then the market settles and adapts. But deflation became the main blame because guess what Hoover decided to do? In his efforts to intervene in the economy, tariffs were raised, and those farmers who were, again, relying on selling off their surplus grain, trying to get it out of the market so they could actually make somewhat of a profit, suddenly found tariffs in their way from every other European power they were trying to sell them to. As one can imagine, it didn't go well, so they had to offload their surplus on Americans, which meant cheaper grain, so they had to compete with cheaper grain that they couldn't afford to sell. And thus it literally rotted as they tried to sell it. And of course, because of the aforementioned measures to try to keep people employed backfiring, those people who would have normally been buying the grain and, eating food, now couldn't because they didn't have a job. The Depression was built on a number of factors, and while deflation was involved, it was a correction to inflation. And, importantly, was not the big enemy that it was made out to be. But remember who came after and was supposed to solve the Depression? Franklin Delano Roosevelt, who promised to intervene in the economy, which required more money in the economy, and thus inflation. So what was going on that was the opposite of that was pushed to the side, especially during the 40s, 50s, and 60s, because that was the age of the New Deal and its subsequent adoptions by many other politicians. We can get into a discussion on how good the New Deal actually was. I'll say it bluntly, not a fan. But the fact is, deflation was demonized by the New Dealers and others because it was seen as the thing that caused the Depression. They cited the farmers' struggles as the reason why the economy went kaput, ignoring the fact that, one, Hoover actually caused this in part because of his interventions and putting more money into the economy by trying to keep wages artificially high, and two, another important thing that's often left out, there was actually a smaller recession that happened only a few years before the Great Depression, which was ended by tax cuts. Literally, the government spending less money and getting less involved in the economy. Food for that. But now that I've gone over all this background, why would I argue for deflation now? Well, here's the thing. Deflation incentivizes savings. Now, this may seem like something that makes no sense to argue when you consider that the economy is literally calculated by how much is spent. Consumer spending, investments, etc. But here's the thing. Savings is the backbone of an economy because fundamentally it ensures that an economy is strong for a longer period. Let's say, hypothetically, you have a car and it breaks down. If you have savings, you can repair it. If you don't, you can't use that car, which means all the things you would buy to maintain the car can't be used. All the oil you need to drive that car, or electricity if it's an electric vehicle, all of it isn't being bought. All of the things you would buy for it or to maintain it during that period aren't being purchased because you're focused on, fixing the thing that broke that you can no longer drive it because of. And thus, all that spending is not involved in the economy. And more importantly, all the economic transactions and other things that would be facilitated by that vehicle, like you driving to work, driving to the store, or any other thing, no longer possible unless you decide to get a bus or some other form of public transit. Again, when you have savings, you can pay your way to fix things in a timely manner. Things that you normally could not do if you were constantly spending. Unless you are really, really rich. But given that most people are not, that is not relevant to the vast majority. And so fundamentally, to have a stable, successful economy, you need people to have savings. You need people to be able to invest in their future. One of the easiest ways is to incentivize them. And what better incentive than if you stick your money into a savings account, it accrues. Not just interest, but the dollar gains value over time. If you put it in the stock market, sure, the stocks may not grow as quickly, but your dollar is growing the entire time. Fundamentally, deflation encourages savings. It encourages that backbone of the economy. And by having it encouraged, you will necessarily encourage the economy to strengthen itself. Because remember, when you're relying on inflation, fundamentally you are saying that people should have less money now, less money in the future, so that we can have more spending now and grow the economy quicker. That is the argument you are making. The problem is, when your economic projections and wages do not align with the inflation the person that you're dealing with is currently experiencing, so say your average working man in a coal mine, factory, service industry, whatever, well, guess what? They have less money to spend on average because fundamentally their money is less valuable. They have less value to contribute to the economy than before. It's essentially a bubble. You keep increasing the value of everything but the money. Well, guess what? No longer is the money able to buy things, so things crash down and you have to recover. Deflation, though it may not allow for rapid growth, can still allow a semi-stable growth that isn't as damaged by recessions. Am I saying a recession won't occur if we have deflation? No. Let's face it, life is as it is, people are people, and just odds are that someone's going to cause a recession somehow. Leave it to humanity, really. But if you want consistent growth while encouraging savings, deflation is the best way to get it. Because deflation builds savings, savings build stability, and with stability and the maintenance of an effective economy, things grow. Plus, there's an added benefit if you're looking at it from the government's perspective. If your money is gaining value, if this dollar can buy more over in China, over in Japan, over in the EU, over in Russia, suddenly people are going to want to keep those dollars. Especially people like, say, the PRC, the Russians, the Europeans, Africans, anyone who wants to actually have a good back for their currency is going to want US dollars. Because if these go up in value proportional to their currencies, then buying a bunch of them suddenly ensures that they have a growth of wealth that they can safely rely on, which is very valuable. It thus boosts US influence in trade because everyone's got US dollars to an even greater extent. And so the dollar becomes more important. Essentially, while yes, there are natural benefits to inflation, I won't deny that. For example, the encouragement of growth absolutely helps, and inflation is one of the ways to do that. Also, decreasing your currency's value relative to other countries allows for benefits in trade. Having a strong currency and deflationary growth in terms of the value of the dollar rising alongside growth means for a more stable and effective economy. And so, I am firmly for deflation. I will say it bluntly. That'll be all.